Logan Gilbert has been a horse for the Mariners over the last 2 seasons. His 376 innings ranks 11th in that period of time, and he's off to a strong start in 2024. So let's dig into what he changed from 2023 and talk about how adding and adjusting pitches could affect a pitcher's biomechanics. From a shapes perspective, Gilbert does a lot of things well. In Fangraph's Stuff Plus model, he's top 5 among starting pitchers, right behind Hunter Green, Jared Jones, and Dylan Cease, just in front of Tyler Glasnow. But unlike everybody in that top 5, he's getting to that plus-plus mix in a different way. Green, Jones, and Glasnow all have electric fastballs. Gilbert, on the other hand, has more of an average fastball, which you could argue is undersold a bit in stuff models if you believe outlier extension like Gilbert's should have more of an impact on a fastball's grade. So he has an average fastball, and what does he do to it this season? Well, he stops throwing it as much. It's down in usage from 42% to 28%. He's cut almost 10 percentage points of usage against right-handed hitters specifically, and almost 20 points of usage versus left-handed hitters. His fastball allowed the most damage in his mix last season compared to his other pitches. If you want to justify a cut in usage, I think that's a pretty good starting point. Or maybe Gilbert secretly spent some time with Andrew Bailey this offseason, who knows? But when you decide that you only want to throw your fastball 30% of the time, you have to replace it with something that can get strikes for you. So it made a lot of sense for Gilbert to add a cutter. We just didn't know it would be this good. I've talked about it in other videos, but cutters are good when they're either thrown hard or have more sweep or glove side movement than average. The average right-handed cutter is 90 miles per hour with 8.5 inches of vertical break and 3 inches of sweep. To get to a 147 Stuff Plus cutter, which is near an 80 grade offering per Fangraphs Stuff Plus and the best cutter in baseball among starting pitchers, you have to exceed some of those variables, which is really hard to do because generally as you throw a cutter harder, you make it more like a four-seam fastball. If you were to cue a pitcher to throw his cutter grip harder and harder, most of the time it would just move this way on a pitch plot and look more like a four-seam fastball, which means more vertical break and more velocity. Gilbert is getting his cutter to 91.4 miles per hour with 10 inches of vertical break and 4 inches of sweep. So it's harder with less drop because it has more vertical break and more sweep or glove side movement than the average cutter. I think stuff models in general struggle with cutters because I feel like most of the time the intent is not really to miss bats but rather to generate weak contact. And models really like swing and miss more than weak contact generally because they believe pitchers have more influence over swing and miss than they do ball in play. Stuff Plus models aren't perfect, but they're the best starting point we have to understand pitch quality. I do think the Fangraphs grade is a bit aggressive around 145. I would guess it has to do with the fact that you're adding velocity relative to average and also glove side movement, and we generally, again, don't see those two variables increase together. The results in the cutter look pretty great so far too. It's missing a good amount of bats, more than the average cutter, and the exit velo launch combination implies it won't be much of a flyball pitch as other things in his mix. The new cutter is also changing how he approaches left-handed hitters from a location standpoint. Last year, his fastball covered a lot of the zone, mostly outer third of the plate and up. This season, with the addition of the cutter, he's moved the fastball more down in the zone and away to left-handed hitters, while the cutter exists more middle of the plate. So the approach of his mix as a whole goes from looking like this last year to now this in 2024. The main thing you'll notice is that he just has something to work inside against left-handed hitters, which I think has really helped out his splitter on the outer third of the plate in particular. Small sample swing and miss on his splitter is a bananas 80%, which is obviously going to come down, but I'm pretty sure it's going to linger above the 33% swing and miss it had last season. Maybe that's just because the splitter is slightly different than it was last year. It was harder with more arm side movement last season. Now it's a bit slower and acting almost a bit like a knuckle split. But I'd argue that splitter improvement in results connects somehow to this cutter, even if it's not the driving force behind that pitch in particular dominating. Branching away from fastball usage and implementation of this cutter, let's talk about some more high-level things in regard to how Gilbert moves. I mentioned his extension was an outlier, and it is, but it's actually up from last season by about 2.5 inches, now sitting at 7.7 feet, which is inside the 99th percentile in Major League Baseball, somehow even more of an outlier than he was last season. We also see Gilbert's release and arm angle both drop. His release is down by about 2.5 inches and his arm angle by 4 degrees. That's natural as extension increases to see a lower release. I would also actually expect him to become slightly more horizontal on some of his pitches he throws because of this arm slot drop. For example, if you're over the top backspinning the ball and you lower your release, you'll naturally convert a bit more of that backspin into side spin. So the ball will maybe move slightly less vertically and a tad more horizontally, either arm side or glove side. This is why as you lower your release height or arm angle, the average vertical break on a fastball decreases from an expectation standpoint. For Gilbert, he's lowering his arm and release slightly, and most of what he's throwing is moving more to his glove side this season. His fastball has 1.5 inches less arm side movement. His slider has another inch of glove side movement. His splitter, as we talked about, is 3 inches less arm side movement. And his curveball is now a sweeper, the latter of which here, that curveball adjustment, I think is a bit more intentional, where the first 3 might be more byproducts of how he's moving differently. The curveball change into a sweeper is probably the easiest thing to pick out when you look at a pitch plot. The pitch got harder by about 2.5 miles per hour. It has 3 inches more glove side movement or sweep. And more notably, the pitch gained 8 inches of vertical break. So it's dropping a lot less, which is textbook for a sweeper. And that's really why I don't think it's a curveball anymore. I do find it a bit odd, however, that the usage of this new curveball is mostly to left-handed hitters and really heavily on 0-0 pitches or the first pitch of an at-bat. Sweepers are generally better versus same-handed hitters. So to me, it's almost like he has a sweeper now, but he's using it as a curveball, when I would expect a sweeper like this to be used as a true slider, which means same-handedness, so right-handed hitters, and when he's ahead in the count. But regardless, this doesn't really seem to matter too much in terms of his overall performance. The reason I bring this all up about Gilbert's mechanics, changing the curveball to a sweeper, adding the cutter, is that I've been thinking a lot more about how adding pitches to a repertoire affects a pitcher's biomechanics, which is unfortunately a topic that I can't really get into objectively because we don't have much public biomechanic info, but it's something that's been brought up to me by some other sharp coaches that I talked to. Multiple non-Braves contacts of mine have wondered aloud whether Spencer Strider adding a curveball had more of an effect on his mechanics and eventual UCL tear than has been reported. It seems like an old school idea, right? Adding that pitch is going to pop your UCL, whatever. And there's maybe some merit to it, but I just think it's much more nuanced, especially for a guy who wasn't ever holding that much supination at game intensity in the past like Spencer Strider. The question from a development standpoint here is whether how the body naturally moves needs to dictate what the throw looks like and then what the shapes look like. Or is it the other way around, which would be chasing stuff without much care for how the body is moving and affecting the throw? An example of that would be the Yankees. I don't think they do this full on, but if you're making a scale between body dictating stuff and stuff above all, I think the Yankees lean towards the stuff side of things. The Yankees, like East-West profiles, get their pitchers into a lot of crossbody positions to achieve those desired shapes, and as one coach told me, these are a lot of IR dominant positions, particularly in the hips, which means internal rotation. So if a pitcher isn't an IR dominant pitcher, then it could be cumbersome for him to fit into that crossbody East-West mold that the Yankees like. My counter to that is that the Yankees are one of the sharper teams from a workload and biomechanics standpoint, at least I think. So I would bet they're not forcing pitchers into these positions, but rather that they just acquire the types of pitchers that do this well or heavily value it. So it seems like they just have a lot of these guys, and perhaps a few of them maybe shouldn't be doing so, but the net for them is really positive. In Gilbert's case, the question is a chicken or the egg problem. Did adding the cutter and adjusting the curveball into his sweeper change how he was moving, resulting in the lower release and more glove side on a few of his pitches? Or was there a conscious mechanical change that occurred first, and the cutter was more of an afterthought that would help him versus lefties, and the same idea with the sweeper? I would bet with below 80% confidence that it was the cutter and sweeper first, and that changed how he moves a little, but I'm open to the opposite. The concern with this can be twofold. One is a question of whether he's moving better or worse, comparing 2024 with these adjustments to 2022 and 2023. Unfortunately, I'm not going to attempt to answer that without a Kinetrax output of some kind. The second concern here, although it's not really backed up by the data, primarily because I haven't actually seen too much data on it, but I've heard it from coaches, is that by adding the cutter, you could affect the pitcher's four-seam fastball. The idea here is that because a cutter is oftentimes just an offset four-seam thrown pretty similarly, that the pitches might blur together, right? The guy might not have the hand feel necessary to distinguish between those two shapes, and therefore he starts releasing his fastball with a bit more supination and cut to the pitch, which could affect the shape negatively depending on the thrower, depending on a lot of variables. There's also ways to teach this from an orientation perspective such that it doesn't happen, which I've heard from some coaches. We're not entirely sure whether this has happened with Gilbert yet. It may be some time before we see any effects, and then once those effects happen, we'll have to see whether the fastball is actually worse and how that affects the rest of his mix. At the end of the day, you could also just assume the Mariners are really sharp at thinking about how changing pitches affected Gilbert the mover down the mound and have actually addressed anything they saw pop up on the biomechanics side of things as a potential red flag. In that case, most of what I brought up around whether the new pitches could actually affect him as a thrower are probably not really concerns. I do think it's important to reason through adjustments in this way, especially for non-Mariners pitchers and other organizations we maybe don't think are as sharp as the Mariners. What I'm going to start asking coaches is, how did you expect pitcher A to change movement-wise when you gave him this new pitch? And then how did he actually change once you saw him in game action with this new offering? I think it would force them to some extent to bridge the gap between expectation and reality and flip the idea of adding a new pitch to more of how is it affecting the body rather than how is it being used in the repertoire. I think usage in the repertoire is probably a really easy thing to circle around to. It's more complex to think about how it could be affecting the throw of the pitcher and then what health implications that could have. So I'm going to see what responses I get on that. I think they'll be all over the place. I'll share them with you if I find any of them pretty interesting. But I do really like Logan Gilbert going forward. I think he's an AL Cy Young candidate. I'm excited to see him pitch the rest of the season. I think he's arguably one of the best arms in the Mariners rotation. If you have any thoughts on this topic, I know it's pretty nuanced. Drop them in the comments. As always, I will be there. Hope you learned something here. And as always, thank you for watching.